So today we have the greatest pleasure of having Charles Gaines join us from his studio in LA right now. So we will share the next hour also with Charles and also Cosmin Costinas, curator and director at Parasite. He will also be our host tonight. So please allow me to introduce Charles to everybody. Charles Gaines is a pivotal figure in the field of conceptual art. His body of work engages formulas and systems that interrogates relationships between the objective and the subjective realms. Using a generative approach, create a series of works in a variety of mediums. He has built a bridge between the early conceptual artists of the 1960s and 70s and subsequent generations of artists pushing the limits of conceptualism today. Charles currently lives and works in LA, where he is a member of the CalArts School of Art faculty. He has been the subject of numerous exhibitions in the United States and also internationally. His work is also in prominent public collections, museums all over the world. So without further ado, let's welcome Charles and Cosmin.
Thank you, Anchi. And Charles, really thank you. It's a great honor to have you with us today. It's an even greater honor to have you in the exhibition that we're looking forward to opening next Friday and Saturday in Hong Kong. And to give a chance to our audiences in Hong Kong, and given the situation, probably only to the audience in Hong Kong, as there will probably not be any travel over the next months to see your work in person. And I would like to start our conversation by talking a little bit about that, about this series and about its genesis, and particularly about your thinking around it. And I would also like particularly to ask you of like how you see it connected to your interest in your work with music and with systems of notating music in particular. So it would be great if you can speak a little bit about that.
Sure. As you know, my work is based in systems, and I got interested in working that way because years ago I had questions about making works of art based upon my subjectivity. I'll put it that way. That a work of art would be an exclusively intuitive act. Now, I have nothing against intuition. That's fine, but I had a problem with the idea that the entire domain of a work of art is an intuitive product, and out of that comes this idea of expression, of course, which is linked to intuition, because you express what you intuit. And so it was a practical thing for me, because when I was in graduate school, I made art in the way that I described. I was making paintings at the time, and I could not feel any affection or affinity for the objects I was making by realizing images that way. For me, it all seemed very arbitrary. So ultimately, I came up with this idea of developing a system that would make the types of decisions that one's creative imagination would normally make. I was very happy with coming up with creating or imagining the system, but I wanted that system that I imagined to actually be the tool that made the art, so that everything that you see in the art could be traced back to a systematic origin rather than my creative unconscious. And so it was simply a matter that I bet you $1 million trillion zillion that you can make art this way. And so I don't know if I lost a bet. We'll see. But that was the basis of it. The trees came about because I saw in the tree, particularly the deciduous tree, I saw in them, I saw in them a kind of a natural systematic operation, generally determined by genetic patterns. That trees are governed in their growth by certain genetic properties. And so what you see as a tree is an expression of those genetic properties. It's not an expression of an imagination, it's an expression of a certain kind of genetic properties that's understandable by science. So I saw how trees are determined as a form by those properties, and that makes them different from, for example, shoes or horses. And I was interested in what constrained the tree, what constrained it so that it didn't become something else like a horse. So, I thought about this and I said, well, maybe I can use the tree to stand in for a genetic code and play out that genetic code to see what kind of forms are produced. The forms that would have produced would not be predictable by me because I was leaving that up to the code. And so I developed this algorithmic type system whose codes produce the decisions that govern the form. The tree itself was an established object, and so it was a matter of finding out what are the possible variations of the tree form that can be produced by this genetic code. In order to do that, I decided to layer the shapes of the same kind of tree on top of each other in a system or in a series. And the visual image that would be produced by that would constitute the kinds of intuitive gestures or intuitive marks that you normally make in making a drawing or a painting. Like, for example, like the terms of colors, what colors to use, or how to mix colors. Normally you would make those decisions based upon your imagination, but I let those decisions be determined by the code, and I could play that code out by using a number of trees of the same sort and playing them out over a system. So that's the system, that's the way it works. So that what you see as a final result is the production of this code or this algorithm. And finally, I was interested in the fact that by doing this, I could still say I was behaving like an artist, even though I wasn't given the whole thing over to my imagination, that I was still being a real artist and making these, because the objects, I think, constituted and justifiably works of art. That is, that you would read them as works of art, not as scientific propositions, for example. And that that you would have the same kind of effect as work of art. In other words, you would read them, poetically. You would have a sense of their aesthetic quality, and you would find them maybe interesting or beautiful. They're not designed to prove any hypothesis like in science. They're designed to produce this aesthetic and critical object.
And so
I hope it made sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, you see the construction of the system, behind it. So, it's the very definition of like how sense is constructed. So it certainly made a lot of sense. But I'm curious to extend this more into music then. And then how do you see music applying the same principles that you mentioned?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm working on a piece now called Manifesto 4, which is a piece I'm organizing for an exhibition in San Francisco. And I'm having such a great time doing this. I mean, it's just been very revelatory because, so let me see if I can express this very briefly. The Manifesto Series is essentially a series of installations that involves video, sound, and drawings. And I take a manuscript, not a manuscript, but a document. Well, it could be a manuscript, but it's a document, and mostly a political document. I translate the letters of that document into musical notes. So the letters A through G turn into the notes A through G. And I also produce B flat. I turn the H's into B flat. I sequence the notes in the same order that they appear in the manuscript. Then I attach chords to the notes, and those chords are determined by the words that the letters form. In other words, the chord is performed for the length of time or for the number of letters that are in a particular word. So when you hear the music, you hear a melody, which are the sequence of letters, and you hear a harmony, which are the chords that accompany that sequence of letters, both determined by the system. So as you can see in that diagram, in that photograph, on the right are large drawings of the actual compositions that I write. And those compositions in that drawing are arranged for an ensemble, and that ensemble then plays it in a sound studio. And I take that sound and play it while the text, the original text that I was using, scrolls on the video. So the issue is that, like, the music that you hear is actually being written by the text, not by my imagination. Right. So at first, what I would do is I would write the raw translation and write it in the form of a piano score, and then I would give it to a composer friend of mine to write an arrangement for an ensemble, and that's what we played. I did this for Manifestos 1 and 2. But for Manifestos 3, I decided to write the arrangement myself. And so this took me into an entirely different realm of having to figure out how the terms and rules for writing an arrangement from a score that was very, methodically produced. That is that it was, and turning the letters to notes, I stayed true to the letters and true to the notes. And, true to the letters, I didn't make any changes, but that was raw material for writing a composition. And so you can make some decisions of your imagination in writing the composition. I was concerned about how I would employ my imagination in making that translation. And I didn't have to worry about that when somebody else was writing the arrangement. But when I decided to do it myself, I recognized the complexity of trying to stick with that strategy. And what I'm discovering, and what I started discovering in doing my arrangements, is that I'm allowed, and I find myself happy with taking the raw score and making changes and adjustments within a set of constraints and restrictions, of course, and making these changes and instructions in order to make the composition musical. A lot of people would say, oh, well, there you go. You see, you're using your imagination and you're creating an aesthetic object from your imagination. So your whole project is a fraud, Charles Gaines. But then I said, no, because what I discovered is that I used the score as a kind of, what it is that I'm mining the score to find out what it produces. And of course, my imagination is involved in that, but the melodies that I realize that are actual changes and adaptations from the raw score, those melodies come from the raw score. They don't come from my imagination. In other words, I don't think, well, what kind of melodic line should I write now? It's by playing the raw score that I hear stuff that then that evolve into what I'm calling a greater musicality of the work. And so I'm discovering that now, really for the first time, and I'm just having a ball.
I have another question, because your work has, commonly been ascribed in, well, different degrees of relation to the conceptualist moment or the conceptualist, broader conversation in art. And that at its turn has evolved significantly in the last decades, and it has also shifted its relationship to, well, I guess, like different intellectual references and also to politics. So I would like to ask you, and this is always an interesting question to ask an artist, how he or she positions towards the, let's say, art historical reception of their work. But I would basically want to ask you, how do you feel about being included in this conversation, and what do you think is, the common reception of your work in this complicated recent history of conceptualism gets right, and what does it get maybe not so accurate?
Yeah, well, I discovered that people have positioned me between first and second generation conceptualists. And I, in terms of the years, it's actually true, because I'm actually younger than Joseph Kosuth and Saul LeWitt, but older than Lawrence Simpson and Glenn Ligon. So I'm right in between them in terms of age. But I guess also you can also say that there is that there was a interest that the conceptual artists of the 60s had that I didn't have, and the conceptualism extended from minimalism the idea of making an object that was essentially empirical, that they wanted to remove the idea of subjectivity in the way that I've been talking about lately. They wanted to remove that, but their strategy of removing it was to make the object an empirical object that was not given to interpretation. They were kind of suspicious and afraid of metaphor. And at the same time, by doing this, they could rethink, as part of the avant-garde, they could rethink and make a new proposition about what constituted a work of art. So I was interested in the avant-garde premise of rethinking works of art, what it means to make it and what's involved. I was interested in continuing that enterprise, at the time that I was a young artist, but I wasn't interested in giving up on representation, and I was particularly interested in representation, and then I was particularly interested in interpretation and metaphor. The politics that I think that people associate with my practice to the degree that they do are evolved out of that interest. That is, that in order for work to have a political location, it has to be through representation, because representation takes you right back to the social and cultural interests. The idea of an empirical object continues this notion of, with respect to moving away from subjectivity, continues this notion of a universal art object, which I had great suspicions about, because I think that the empiricism of the minimalism was a failed idea. It was essentially New York art, and maybe parts of Europe, but it wasn't a universal set of aesthetic values. It was localized around New York and Western Europe. But it was through representation that I can get to the idea of politics. And so I stayed with that. I mean, the reason I got interested in trees, because it was an image, and it was about considering, determining, or theorizing, or thinking through how we perceive things in the world and how do we attach meaning to them. So that's a whole enterprise that happens when you're dealing with images within the frame of representation. So my interest in representation, I think, is the reason why I'm bridged between the first generation and the second generation. I think that the politics of the second generation is just pretty clear. And I was using the same kind of empirical strategies that the first generation was using, systems and language. But I used those in order to interrogate images, rather than trying to realize an absolutist object. And in the process of interrogating images, I was using the same kind of linguistic tools that introduce cultural ideas into the whole fray of the experience. And that opened the door for me to get more specifically into political content. And it also maybe, explains why I've been called a transitional figure. I guess I have to also say that this notion of making a transitional figure is a rewriting of history, because nobody said that about me until 5 years ago. I'm giggling about it, but that, you know, because it's only within the last, I guess more than 5 years, about 10 years ago, that my work started to getting a little attention again, because I went through, you know, almost a decade and a half with no attention. And nobody then said I was a transitional figure at that time. But now, you know, like every time I turn around, I'm transitional. It's hard for me to actually accept that I was this sort of a fake force in history. I just don't believe it. But I'm just telling you what I heard.
Yeah, it often happens like that. Well, since this is a studio visit, I think it would be great to also like hear more about what you're interested in at the moment and what you're working on. You mentioned a little bit, yes, the work, but would be great to hear more of your current interests and what are you, you know, hoping to create in the next period.
Well, it just so happens that I have an exhibition at the London Hauser Wirth Gallery coming up next year. And I have been developing, it is pretty close. I've gotten to a point where I'm not closing it off, but I've gotten to a point where I'm pretty close to ending the Gridded Trees series. Unless something interesting comes to mind, then all bets are off. But I did have this piece that I wanted to do for London that I wanted to do for a long time, and so the opportunity of showing there allowed me to do that, and especially because I wanted to do work that actually, at least in a few instances, approached the scale of an actual tree. And so London is allowing me to do, among the projects that I'm working on, allowing me to do these really large gridded trees. I'm imagining them to be almost 20 by 25 feet. And I don't know what that is in meters, they're featuring the oak trees in Britain, and I think that's appropriate because those trees are pretty massive. So I'm very interested in pushing this idea of allowing the show to help me push this idea of scale in that series. There are a couple of other changes, different things that are going on in the series that are really different from what I've done before. And I'm also in that same show working on a continuation of a series that I call Faces, work that is the first examples of that I did in the late 70s. This series follows a show that I did in New York 3 years ago on identity politics, and this series of Faces deals with the subject of mixed race or multiracial identity. And the series is like the trees. I'm overlaying the contours or the shapes of various faces on top of them in a series. Yeah, that piece that you see on the screen now is the one that I did in New York. The new series, rather than outlining just the shape of the tree, the entire face is filled with color. So there will be these layers of trees that overlay each other that would normally mask each other, but because of the way I mix paint, they mix.
Karl Marx as the outlier?
In this one, yeah, Karl Marx is the yellow shape.
The outlier in the.
And you can see that, I don't know which number this is, but there are about 7 or 8 heads layered on top of each other on this piece. And the last, I think I did 12 in the series. Additionally, I'm working on a work called Night Crimes, not Night Crimes, but Skybox for San Francisco, which is an expanded version of a piece I did about 7 years ago. And in this work, I got photographs of the night sky, and I made a structure where I made a relationship between a crime scene, the face of a convicted criminal, or in this case, somebody convicted of a capital crime, and a large photograph of the night sky. So it created this sort of three-part complex where it was implied the relationship is that the criminal committed the crime, and on the date of the sky that you're looking at. So for example, the night sky changes, it constantly changing. And so every day of the year, it's different. It returns to its normal place on the 366th day. How many days in a year? 365, yeah. On the 366th day, it goes back to January 1 sky, and it changes, like clockwork. And so if a crime was committed on December 3rd, I was able to recreate what the night sky looked like on December 3rd. And so the idea was this, that I found a photograph and found that the crime was committed on December 3rd. I arbitrarily selected a mugshot of a convicted criminal, conflated with the photograph, and then I found the night sky that was present at the moment of the crime, and produced a large photograph of that night sky as if that sky witnessed the crime. And so in Skybox, and this piece that you're seeing is not Skybox, it's a work that actually predated Skybox that led me into it. But with Skybox, what I did was that I made these large panels of text, and the texts were political manifestos. And we found a way to take the photographs of the night sky, like you see one of those photographs. We found a way of translating that photograph in such a way that we could laser cut the holes into the panels that duplicated the photograph. And we were able to duplicate, the stars are different sizes. We duplicated their sizes. We even duplicated their colors. But we did that by cutting holes. And then behind the holes, we put gels that corresponded to the color of the star. That we tried to be true to the photograph. And then behind that were lights. It's like a light box. So when this was installed, you walked into the room and you would see, for example, panels like you see here, where you would then begin reading the text, hopefully, getting all kinds of interesting bits of political history. And surprisingly, then you notice that the lights will start dimming and it make it difficult for you to read. And this would take, it would dim maybe 30, 40 seconds. And then it would become pure black. And when it was pure black, you couldn't see anything in the room except for the stars. The way we engineered the piece, it didn't look like photographs of stars. It looked just like you're looking at the night sky. And it has this tremendous emotional effect, tremendous. I mean, some people said they started crying because you felt that you're in this kind of presence of deep space. And the same thing if you're at night and you're in the mountains, you look up at the sky, you're always awestruck by the night sky. It was very similar to that. So I was interested in attaching that emotional response to the political text that you're reading. Trying to make a correlation, just like in the Skybox, where I was trying to make a correlation between crime and the night sky. And so you would sit in darkness for a couple of minutes, and then slowly the lights would come back on. So this piece for San Francisco is going to occupy an entire room. So it's going to be a massive piece. The panorama of text and sky will be probably 40 feet long and 16 to 18 feet high. So it would be totally experiential.
I have another question, because I remember when we did the studio visit together early last year, you were also talking about your interest in opera. And I wanted to ask more about that, and how did that, how is that evolving?
Yes, yeah, the Manifesto series, you know, I mean, I was trained as a musician, so for
Hello?
Practice and my musical interest, and I pretty much put music aside because of that. And I thought that there wouldn't be any way to connect the two. But then I found I worked with, I collaborated with Terry Atkins a few times on his Lone Wolf project. And Terry was a musician as well as a sculptor. And he had no trouble, collapsing his music and his sculpture work. And so that really impressed me. And I was trying to find a way to do that. And so the Manifesto series was my first successful attempt at bridging my interest in music and my interest in visual practice. So in the course of working with that, it just turns out that I did a piece called Song Text, where I used voice for the first time. The other pieces were all instrumental. And this happened about the very same time I was involved in this project, which I called the Dred Scott project. Dred Scott was an African-American pre-Civil War who sued to get his freedom. He was a slave, but he was born in the United States. He sued to get his freedom, and this is famous because the Supreme Court of the United States said that he had no status to sue because he was not a citizen of the United States. Essentially, the reason he wasn't a citizen of the United States, essentially the reason was the United States was created to be a white nation. So the United States was created for white people. And so a black person couldn't possibly be a citizen. So it's called the worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. And I got interested in this because a lot of the issues that were going on during the Dred Scott issues is still alive. So I got the idea of doing an opera. It extended from the sound text piece when I started working with voices. And so I decided that it might be interesting to write an opera, write a Dred Scott libretto and form an opera around that libretto. And I'm right at the beginning of doing that right now. We have some potential, and we have interest in terms of its ultimate performance. But because operas are humongous projects, I don't suspect that it's going to be done for at least, if I'm lucky, 2.5 years to 3 years.
I think another question that is important to discuss now is about the current situation and its implications. I think we're all watching with dismay and concern, the catastrophe unfolding in America and a few other places, and wanted to ask you, how do you see this influencing your own artistic practice, and also perhaps also more broadly about what needs to be done and can be done in the cultural and public sphere in the United States, and maybe also of how this will then shape the international dialogue, considering that what we do now also is an example of that.
It's an interesting question because this what's going on right now is such an emotional issue to me. Right now, so I mean, I have to be particularly careful because I'm in a vulnerable age group for the virus, and so we've been shuttered in place for almost 7 weeks now. What is clear to me is that we're in a particular problem in the United States and probably in the world because of how this pandemic is being handled by Trump and the president. That he's the worst person to have this kind of power at this time. It couldn't have been, I mean, I don't think that a Twilight Zone episode, it wouldn't have passed. The Twilight Zone people would say, no, nobody would believe it. You know, so it's just infuriating because we are all, and the world is all victims of his narcissism. And people are literally dying because of him. And I never thought in a million years that I mean, I thought like his election was a big tragedy and like it was going to be horrible. But I never thought that he would make it so that maybe I wouldn't survive, you know, that I wouldn't live. I never thought it would actually, his election would do that. And here it is. So it's completely, for the moment, destabilized the practical aspects of an artistic practice. Because when it became palpable and we got the order to quarantine, we shut the studio down. We have 15 people working for us, and so 7 weeks ago we closed the studio down. I mean, we put everybody on I gave them a paid leave so that they would not, you know, be in the ranks of all of these people who are unemployed. There's an enormous number of the unemployed is being developed, and so ultimately we developed a certain kind of project so that my folks could actually then work at home, because they weren't happy just sitting there, right? So they're working at home. So I'm actually developed a piece, and there are a lot of people who are very happy that I developed this piece. But I actually developed a piece that I wouldn't have or been in the back burner, except for this crisis. And I think that this moment is probably creating that kind of situation for many artists, and most artists, where they're actually rethinking the parameters of their practices. They're being forced to think of those parameters, and it's quite possible that what we learn from that might have a long-lasting effect upon our works when things get back to so-called normal.
Yeah, let's see when that will be and what shape it will take. Well, I mean, maybe just to insist on the last part of the question of, like, you know, and how do you see, because obviously you've, you know, been shown, you know, around the world, and you know, for whatever that means, you're certainly an artist who belongs to an international community and an international narrative, a global narrative of art. So how do you see that aspect of our shared culture and also of our lives evolving in the next years, given the current crisis and the parochial response that it has triggered in most places around the world?
I think that's an awfully interesting question, because for some reason, the politics around dealing with this crisis is just struggling between a global and an individual response. And then some people are even saying that, you know, this might have lasting effects upon the viability of various global type enterprises, like maybe art. I mean, for example, or we're talking about how we have to rethink the studio with respect to this, and you might have to rethink travel, the viability of global interconnections, or what we have to do to try to, if we see that in crisis, what we might have to do to try to reinvent things so that it doesn't fall to the wayside. I think that those things are wide open, and I find it so unfortunate, because for years and years, it was had people in the United States, some people in the United States knew about my practice, but Europe didn't, and Asia didn't. I mean, nobody else did. It was just like Roxana knew about my practice, my wife, but but in the last couple of years, I've been enjoying this kind of globalized experience and this sort of international discussion of my practice, but an international discussion of art. It's more decentralized discussion of art, really different from when I was young, because when I was young, everything came out in New York. But now there's this really much more interesting worldwide narrative of art going on, and this movement of works of art. And right at the time that I'm becoming a beneficiary of that, things are starting to shut down. I feel it's too bad.
We would have loved to have you here with us, at the opening and do this, live in the exhibition in Hong Kong. So, it's a small example of that.
Yeah, I mean, in normal times, I wouldn't, like I would have been on the plane whether you invited me or not. But now I have to say what is going on in the world before I can make that kind of decision. It's not that I wouldn't do it, but it's a more considered decision, and not only in terms of accepting, but even for people who are producing projects, what it means to invite people, to make that kind of decision. It becomes sort of a heavy. It becomes suddenly heavy, something that should be full of joy.
Yeah. Yeah, it would, border irresponsibility to put somebody on a plane at the moment.
So.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone from our guests also has a question or a comment or something that they would like to ask or know from Charles. No, then I would like to, but I would like.
Are everybody awake? I mean,
we're awake. When is your London show, by the way? I mean, assuming we can get to London and travel to London, although many people say the planes with how they're cleaning them and HEPA filters are the safest place you can be indoors today. But how when is the show expected to arrive?
It's still scheduled for February. I know that here in LA, everyone's expecting that by the end of the summer, things will start opening up. And it all depends, on how, if there is some effort. We all know that the virus is still going to be going on in February, but it depends upon how we can, how the society can form a system of protection, to give people confidence to travel, and we're all hoping that by the fall or winter, such a system will fall into place, so that if we can find certain things to do an acceptable risk.
Yeah. By the way, one of the points, I know it's easy to be negative and pessimistic, but the global cooperation of scientists and people in the medical field is one of the silver linings of this, tragedy.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
And it's just remarkable how countries have come together to share technology and to share DNA sequences, and companies who are rivals and competitors, working together. And it's, there's a lot of interesting things, like you learn, you're talking about Dred Scott, Charles, you're African-American. I see there's Asians, obviously from Hong Kong on the call, there's, tremendous amount of racism about, we heard LACMA do a piece about, Asian American racism. related to the coronavirus. And, you know, I was reading about the Black Plague in the 14th century where, you know, basically they didn't know what caused these things. So they blamed the Jews and they thought the Jews were poisoning the well. So there was the greatest killing of Jews besides the Holocaust during the 14th century because of a plague. So, you know, racism and discrimination has been around for centuries. And, you know, here it is, you know, a tragedy happens in the world, and, you know, a group is scapegoated for it. It's something that's, like you talk about identity politics, which was, I know, a series about identity politics being around for a long time. And here it is, you know, racism this time, whether it's Muslims, now it's Asians, like whatever it is, it's always going to be a group that's going to be scapegoated, which I find really also interesting about this time.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I discovered during the Manifesto series is that often the documents that I research are old. I mean, they could be a couple of centuries old. And one of the things, or, you know, up to, you know, the 20th century, but one of the things I discovered is that these issues, they keep reoccurring. You know, these I don't know how to say it. I don't know how to describe this. I think there is, on the one hand, a general enlightenment, you know, as we move forward in time. You know, because even, for example, in my case, you know, I'm an African-American artist, given opportunities that weren't given African-American artists 30 years ago. And so there has to be some spaces that become more enlightened. So I think this is going at the same time, but always nibbling against that general enlightenment of these retrenched racist and sexist ideas. And the documents that I research reveal their persistence. They just don't go away. And I'm dealing with, this is interesting, when I was doing research for the Dred Scott piece, I was in St. Louis at the courthouse where the actual records are kept. And so I was studying the records and scanning them. And at the same time, that's when I forget it. I feel bad for forgetting the Black man who was killed by a police officer in St. Louis, in the suburb of St. Louis.
Michael.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I forget his name, but that happened just a couple of days before I went to St. Louis. And when I was in the courthouse reading, you know, this, oh my God, these awful statements that Judge Taney, who wrote the majority opinion, reading his awful justifications, that's built in deeply into American racial ideology, racist ideology. I was hearing the protesters outside, and a lot of the things that they were saying and protesting against were the same things as if their protest was being performed against, you know, Supreme Court decision that was made 200 years ago. You know, that it had that kind of timeliness to it, where these negative ideas, these negative political ideas, they just won't die. They just won't go away. I think, unfortunately, we'll never get to a point where they will ever go away. It'll just continue to be a battle. That's one of the things that conclusions I came to working on the Manifesto series.
Are there any other questions or comments?
What's the mood in Hong Kong right now? I mean, being in America, knowing that there were these protests, and then sort of coronavirus happens and you don't really read about them too. It reminded me of when there was the protests against Wall Street, and then all of a sudden it started snowing and everybody left. Occupy Wall Street.
Can you repeat that, because my connection went bad? Can you repeat your question?
Oh, no, I'm just curious. It sounds like there's a lot of interest in your work in Hong Kong, and I just wondered what was going on in Hong Kong these days.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms of the coronavirus, I think the situation definitely like improved significantly than before, and I think it's, well, with all honesty and I think like realism, I think it's a completely different situation than what's going on in America and most of Europe at the moment. I think there's really a process of testing and of like controlling the situation. So there's yeah, it doesn't seem to be an epidemic actually going on in the community in Hong Kong, and I think a lot of it has to do with individual action and community action. I think also the fact that we all wore masks since the end of January, probably that's actually like what made all the difference. Besides a number of other measures and testing and so on and so forth. So I think it's definitely safer to resume with caution many aspects of day-to-day life. The political situation is a different issue. There isn't, I think, because I think like from the outside there seems to be like an immediate sort of like shift from one news story to another. I think already the protests have shifted into a different dynamic before the epidemics hit. So I think that's maybe a minor but probably like crucial distinction that I think already in January, for most of January, the protests subsided or transformed into a different dynamic on one hand, and the epidemic had not hit yet. So I think it remains to be seen what lies ahead in the next months, and with everything going on. But I think in terms of basic safety and also the possibility of doing an exhibition and opening an exhibition in a week, I think it's something that is generally perceived as possible. We realize, because on one hand we obviously work here, and the show will primarily be seen by our community, but we work with all the international artists, and we're part of obviously an international group, and it's almost embarrassing to be opening a show next week, considering that doing this in America would probably be criminal at the moment, and we would obviously not do or support anything like that. But it's simply about assessing the difference in the situation. So I think we can certainly safely do it here, and I hope that will not happen in America.
Just to jump in, I just wanted to say I think it gives us all hope, just so you know. For those of us calling in from the States, I think all of us are counting the days until we can open exhibitions again. So, kudos to you. I apologize about my dog.
No, it's nice to hear the intervention.
The virtual gallery, it's very hard to, I think, look at pieces in 2 dimensions when there's 3 dimensions. I've always found when galleries send us, a PDF, I'm interested, but I'm either wowed when I see it or I'm disappointed. It's just not the same as seeing something in person. And it's nice that everybody's trying this new construct, but it does feel a little bit like it's hard to accept that is going to be the future.
It's hard to really experience art.
Yeah, experience art without seeing it live. Whereas I don't mind Zoom. I feel like there's an intimacy to seeing everybody's face really close up on the screen and talking to you like you're my best friends and live, you're like right across the room. So I don't know, it's different, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there's definitely a physicality and an immediacy to art and to the idea of being in these institutions that we're building that cannot be replaced. I mean, I think a certain degree of online work is important if it gives opportunities to artists and other practitioners to be active and employed, and if people get paid for that. So if there's really if it acts really as a substitute economy, then I think it should be supported as a temporary bridging situation, but it certainly cannot replace the long-term life of art in an institution, and the sense of a real community coming together in an art institution as well. Yeah. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a little late in LA.
Just
Thank
on
you.
behalf of the gallery, I just wanted to thank everybody so much for tuning in, and to Charles for your time and your beautiful words, and for just walking us through a show, even though we're not all there. And Cosmin, thank you so much for putting this all together, and it's wonderful to be connected in this way. And we'll all be together in exhibition soon. I know it. I know that it's
yes.
around.
And then so just to remind our friends in Hong Kong that the exhibition opens on Friday at Parasite, 7 to 9 in the evening, and the venue at the Soho House on Saturday, 16th of May, between 5 and 7. It's a Saturday. And also for friends around the world, we will do a conversation, a very informal, Zoom get-together with all the artists in the exhibition, including Charles, on Thursday, 14th of May, 9 p.m. Hong Kong time. So it will be quite early in Los Angeles. So a particular appreciation for Charles tuning into that. But we had to try a balance as we have artists from very different time zones, from Western Pacific and Mid-Pacific to the Americas and Asia and Europe. So thank you, and hope to see you all there.